welcome to Property Question Time. This is the programme where you can have your property related questions answered by our expert panel. I'm Stephen Gelapin, and joining me today are Steve Jacob. Steve, you're CEO of Fabrik Property Group, welcome. Paul Mahoney, you're MD of Nova Finance Group, again welcome to you. And Nick Wallwork, CEO of propertyforum.com, welcome. So gentlemen, we'll get straight on with the questions, and the first one goes to you, Steve. My children have now left home, but I don't want to downsize. Can I change my home into an HMO and stay in part of it myself? What would I need to do?
Well, I don't specialise in HMOs. The area I'm in is in an Article 4 area. So that's one of the things you have to look out for. If you're in an Article 4 area, they won't allow new HMOs into the town. But if I were to turn my property into a HMO, I would go seek advice from a local planning consultant or architect, and there'll be a procedure to follow to get your HMO in the state it needs to be and licensed.
Okay.
I would consider the management of that as well, because managing HMOs is quite a tough thing to do. And I wouldn't go for the first tenant that come through the door. I'd interview quite a few tenants.
Okay. And is there a difference between creating an HMO out of your own property as opposed to going and investing in a property for the purpose of turning it into an HMO? Is there a difference in regulations?
In regulations, I wouldn't say there would be. I don't know. That's probably something Nick can answer. Okay. But the one thing to think of is how it's going to affect your personal life, having other people in your property while you're living there. I think that's the biggest thing.
I was just thinking that if you're living in quite a big home, to have it suddenly invaded by sort of 4, 6 or 8 other people, that's going to be quite a lifestyle change, isn't it?
Definitely.
Nick, you got any comment on that?
There are slight differences in the regulations, I believe. I've never done it, not in the recent 15 years, so I wouldn't like to comment specifically on that regulation. But suffice to say, you do need HMO licensing for most HMOs. And that basically covers a lot of health and safety stuff. So it's sort of fire doors, fire alarms, making sure that you're up to spec and you and your tenants are safe. So it does change the nature of a property from a residential one to a higher grade of safety when you've got other people.
That's only right, isn't it? There should be
Absolutely.
proper regulation. If you're going to have multiple occupancy, then people have got to feel and be safe. But interestingly enough, what do you think the resistance is by some authorities in saying no to any more HMOs? What's the downside?
I think and Stevie touched upon the Article 4 direction area, and that's in certain towns they put in an area on a map where the permitted development rights to change from a standard C3 residential house to a C4 HMO, a small HMO, has been removed, so you can't do that. And the reason they do that in a lot of areas is sometimes for over-studentification, it's called sometimes. Okay. You might have a really popular student area in a town and every street turns into student HMOs. So then you're left with people that perhaps live in that street and they've got 15 houses that are all student houses. It becomes quite disrupted, and it can really sometimes bring down an area. Students are great tenants, but
we are moving into a time when a far more sort of specifically built, purpose-built blocks really for students, aren't we? And probably that's maybe a better and safer way to go. Any comment on the financing of all this, Paul?
Look, the finance side of things, obviously, if they're looking to turn their residential home into a HMO, they would need to make sure it's okay with their lender, and most residential mortgages wouldn't allow that. You do need to let them know who's living in your property, not even if you're letting it to a single person. So they would need to figure out whether there's a product fit for purpose for that. And to be honest, off the top of my head, I'm not sure if there is.
Would there be a different product, or would they simply just want to charge you a premium over and above?
It would probably be a different product, because a residential mortgage is a consumer mortgage. It's fit for purpose for someone who's actually living there as their primary place of residence, as opposed to it being a business activity, which is essentially what they're switching over to.
I think sometimes can you not get a right to let permission?
You can get right to let, but I'm not sure whether that would apply to still living there and creating a HMO.
It's quite
it also wouldn't be a buy to let because you're still living there.
Sure.
So you would need to figure out whether there's a product available for that, because it is a somewhat unique, decision.
Well, I think like a lot of our subjects, it needs professional advice, doesn't it?
Definitely.
It needs advice from the local authority. It needs advice from specialists in finance, and of course,
and just good conversation with the bank.
Just one more comment on that, so far as whether they should do that or not. And Nick kind of touched on it as to whether HMO even makes sense where their house is, because it may not. HMO has been a big buzzword in the market over the past few years, and some areas are just flooded.
Yeah.
And that's why the local councils want to control them as well.
Okay.
Because I think everyone just assumes that if they create a HMO, they're going to get a fantastic yield. But if it's not let, then there's no yield.
Okay. Right, Paul, we're going to move on to your question. So, can somebody please explain to me the advantages of putting a buy-to-let property in a company rather than having it as an individual? And what percentage of the property's value would be loaned to a company on a buy-to-let mortgage?
Okay. So the idea of investing through a limited company is a little bit controversial as to whether it's the right decision or not and who it's right for. But in general, a lot more people have been investing through limited companies since Section 24 was announced. So essentially the removal of tax deductibility of buy-to-let mortgage interest. For example, I saw some stats recently. Before Section 24 was announced, only 5% of new buy-to-let mortgage applications were for limited companies. And in the final quarter of last year, over 70% were. So now the vast majority of new purchases are being made through limited companies.
Okay.
From a tax perspective, where it starts to sort of make sense to consider that is if you're a higher rate taxpayer, because basic rate taxpayers aren't actually affected by Section 24, and that's a common misconception that they are, but in fact they're not. If your employment income plus your property income is less than 50 grand a year, or 100 grand combined between a married couple, you're not affected by Section 24 at all.
Okay.
If you're a higher rate taxpayer, you are. So that's where if you've got properties with high levels of debt and that debt is less tax deductible than it was before, then assessing the limited company option might be worthwhile.
Okay.
It's difficult to move existing properties in, that can be costly, but perhaps new purchases can be made through a limited company. And loan to values and in fact rates now are becoming quite similar to buy-to-let in your own name. In the past, it was a lot more expensive and loan to values were lower. But because of that shift I mentioned toward this being very popular, competition has grown greatly. The rates are still slightly higher than owning buy-to-let in your own name, but they're getting closer and closer.
Oh. And what are lenders' attitudes to lending to start-up companies with no track record? Are they still looking
They
at
actually
the
prefer
individual? Do they?
Yeah, the vast majority of lenders prefer lending to a special purpose vehicle as opposed to an existing established company that's operating in some other right. The reason for that is it separates the risk. So if I own a laundrette with loads of debt and I want to buy a property in that same company and my laundrette goes bankrupt,
Sure.
well, that could affect the properties.
Yes.
Whereas, if it's in a separate company, you split the risk.
And what about the relationship between the sole director of the company and probably sole shareholder and the limited company? Are they going to look for personal guarantees?
Yes, they do ask for personal guarantees. For the business buy-to-let or limited company buy-to-let, it is a bit more about the purchaser, not just the property they're buying. As buy-to-let itself is more to do with the property you're buying than it is about you as a person, but they do look more at the person when it's through a limited company.
Got it. Okay.
I think it's important to add, if you're deciding on the limited company versus personal route, is what's your goal with that deal? If you want to flip it on, you might want to get capital gains treatment on the sale, which actually buying it personally would be a better option and cheaper. If you're holding it long term, you probably want to have it the limited company route. You can choose when to take your dividends and you can leave money in the company and therefore have less tax.
So would you sell the company as opposed to the property then?
You would, yeah.
Okay,
I mean, if it was in the company, you could.
Would that take you out of stamp duty too?
It reduces the stamp duty, I believe, to 0.5% in a company shares. So you're transacting a company. But if you were to flip it on immediately, you probably wouldn't want to buy it in the company in the first place because you could get capital gains treatment as a private sale rather than the sale of a company.
Okay. Steve, anything to add to that?
Not really. I mean, ever since I started property, I've put all of my properties into one limited company. And the thing I like about going into a limited company is I've chosen to go with one bank who's helping me grow. So I bank with Handelsbanken. And the bigger my portfolio gets, the better the relationship I've got with my bank. Now, I do know that other people have had bad experiences doing that. And I was careful to choose which bank I went with.
But is that all your properties in one limited company or a number of limited companies, each ring-fenced holding the one property?
All of my properties are in one limited company with one bank, Handelsbanken. I chose Handelsbanken because of their ability to advise me on the market. The bank manager they give me is someone who's on the ground all the time, and he knows the market just as well, if not better than me, because he looks at hundreds of deals every week. So I like the fact that I've got quite an intelligent business partner working with me to grow my portfolio.
Okay.
It's interesting because with that scenario, if you're doing building a portfolio and you want to sell that as a whole, that's a really good way of doing it. Someone can buy into a yield and buy a whole portfolio from you very easily and cheaply.
Yeah.
If you wanted to sell an individual company out of that portfolio, you might struggle because you'd have to sell it as a property rather than a company. So someone will be paying more stamp duty. So this swings and roundabouts to every scenario.
100%. And definitely, going back to what Nick said, make sure you know what your goals are when you're entering property from day one. Mine was for a legacy, for a long-term investment, for a pension. That's not everyone's goal.
No.
So.
Okay. Nick, we're going to move on to you now. It's a good job you're not in the government because you'd love this one. With property demand still being high and getting higher by the day, what are developers doing about this to help solve the housing problem that we have in this country?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that developers are trying to build as much as they can. They're always up against the wall of planning, and although there's lots of incentives from the government level, actually that trickling down to local councils is quite tough. I think we need to see a bit of relaxing of certain planning rules, especially at the local level. That's where we get held up always as developers. We're ready to build stuff, and there's seemingly endless hurdles to overcome that can be quite tricky, and not thinking of the bigger picture side of things. In terms of sort of physical developments, we've obviously touched upon HMOs. A lot of developers are doing conversions for HMOs, and that's getting more people into the same building, provided there are good quality standards and they're built to the correct safety standards and quality. That's a really good solution for the lower end professional market that can't necessarily afford to get onto the ladder of buying a property. Micro studios is big. We're micro studio developers as well. We've got numerous sites through the Thames Valley, Reading and Newbury. So we're taking permitted development offices, converting them into residential, into lots of units into one building, all good size, all very well spec'd, but it's being clever about the design and internal layout.
Okay, and I suppose the obvious question is, are developers building what's needed? We have in London here this almost daily criticism of developers building great big glitzy blocks, and they're going off to Singapore, to Hong Kong, to KL to sell them, and it's not really helping our home market.
I think that's quite a specific problem to London. I think London is its own market. It's almost completely.
Do you think it's the same in Manchester and Birmingham? And,
I think it is to a certain extent. We work with a lot of developers. Our clients invest in 30 plus properties a month, and I think sometimes there is a disconnect between what the developer wants and the sort of money they're going to make from it, and what the market wants. Yes. Sometimes some of them get it really well, hit the mark, and others really miss the mark.
Yes, I've always thought actually the key to this is that actually if developers know they can sell what they're building, they'll build as much as you like, and they'll supply as much as you like. And we should probably learn from the car market, because both collapsed in 2008. The car market came out steaming. Why? Because they offer phenomenal finance packages to people and make it affordable. But there we are. Look, gentlemen, that's all we've got time for in this half of the programme. Thank you very much. We're going to take a short break now. We'll be back soon. Welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Gelapin, and with me again is Steve Jacob, Paul Mahoney and Nick Wallwork. Welcome back, gents. Steve, your second question. In our development, the lease clearly states that no animals of any kind are to be kept in the building. I want to have a very small dog and therefore wonder if it is indeed fair to preclude me from having one. I'm pretty sure I've seen other residents coming in and out of the building with their pets. There's a good management question for you.
Okay, so technically, if the lease states you can't have pets, you can't. However, I know that my property litigator has had 2 or 3 of these arguments go all the way through to court. And if you've got a small pet for comfort purposes, most of the time the judge will go on the side of the tenant, and it will be thrown out. However, that is a circumstance-based argument. So, is it easy access for the dog to go to the toilet? It's not a big dog in a small flat. But that is an argument my property litigator has won on a number of occasions for the tenant.
Was it a Chihuahua?
For comfort purposes.
Okay, any comment on that, Nick?
Well, no, I have a small dog, so I'm happy, but I don't rent, thankfully. So.
And are you in a block of flats, or are you in a home?
No, I'm in a house.
In a house.
But I think from a landlord's perspective, joking aside, we just want our properties well kept, and make exceptions in our portfolio for people that have sensible pets. Like you say, if you don't want a Doberman in a studio flat that's going to chew every piece of wood and furniture in there. But
Paul, any consequence for lenders over these potential breaches of lease?
I think obviously if you're breaching the lease and it becomes an issue, that might create a problem with the lender. But based upon that circumstance, I'd say a very sensible approach would just be to ask the landlord first, rather than escalating it too quickly.
We say no pets allowed, but if we get asked, my lettings manager will go and meet the person, look at the pet, and take a view. So
I think I'd fire them. I have to say, I've had these questions probably about the last 35 years, and I've come to the conclusion that, the tenant has a lease, he reads the lease, okay? The landlord produces the lease, he reads the lease. They both agree it and they let the property. So why don't they just do what it says in the lease? It saves an awful lot of trouble.
I'll make it
well,
so
you
easy
find
though,
though,
wouldn't it?
you say that, no, you might find that, you've got an old lady, husband's passed away, she wants a pet for comfort. In that circumstance, you've probably got a tenant there for 10 or 15 years, going to pay on time every time,
She might have forgotten
and
what's
you'll
in it.
kick them out just because a piece of paper says. Don't agree with that. Sorry.
Okay, all right, well, we'll move on. Paul, your second question.
Yeah.
Is there a common denominator in calculating the amount that would be loaned against a property in a buy-to-let mortgage? And how does it work, taking into account rental income?
Okay. So there's two ways that lenders look at how much they'll lend against a buy-to-let property. There's loan to value and there's serviceability. The loan to value is, of course, the loan against the value of the property. And the average maximum, and what I mean by that is the average loan to value that lenders will go to and still be at sensible rates is 75%. Some will go a bit higher, but the rates get higher. And some, if you go a bit lower, the rates get a bit lower. So that gives you a bit of an idea. So if you're buying a £100,000 property, for example, it's pretty straightforward to borrow $75,000 and a 25% deposit. Okay. From a serviceability perspective, generally with buy-to-let mortgages, the serviceability is the rental income from the property. Some changes that took place last year was the Bank of England introduced, they mandated a benchmark rate of 5.5%, meaning that your rent needs to cover a stress test rate of 5.5%, and it needs to cover that 125% of the time.
To take into account voids, obviously.
Voids, maintenance, all that sort of stuff, costs. Yeah. So the way of working out how much you can borrow based upon that is take your monthly rent, times it by 12, divide it by 0.055, and divide it by 1.25. Right. That will give you the amount.
That's good and simple.
What's that?
Well,
off the top of your head, what's that, Stephen?
Yeah. if you remember those figures, it is pretty straightforward. But there is a way around that also, because 5-year fixed products are exempt. Right. So the issue with that change is high value, low yield properties, it affects most. So London, for example, if you run that calculation I just gave, the maximum you can borrow in most London properties is about 55-60%. So it's a big lump of cash to buy a buy-to-let in London, which makes it difficult. But if you go for a 5-year fixed product, quite a lot of those products are at the actual rate. So the rate might be 4% or something, and rather than it being stressed at 5.5, it's stressed at 4.
Okay, I understand. Steve, are you finding any different in the north of England on these calculations? Are you finding it easier or harder to finance buy-to-lets?
Financing buy-to-lets, I wouldn't be able to answer that in my particular area, but definitely the rent cover situation, that's never really been a problem for us in the north. The loan to value is lower, I find. I mean, a lot of lenders will say 75%, but then get closer to the point of lending the money, the loan to value will come down to 70. I mean, I was always advised by people that I took advice off early on was to try and stay as low geared as you possibly can, because in the event of a market crash, they may revalue your portfolio and will want their loan to value kept at where it is. Right. And the more equity you have in your portfolio, the less likely you are to get that knock on the door in a bad market.
Just on that point, there's certain mortgages that they can do that, but most buy-to-let mortgages they actually can't.
Well, they can't review, no?
No. Some they do, and perhaps with your scenario where they're lending on the whole portfolio, they perhaps can. But with your standard buy-to-let, even if the value drops by 50%, they can't recall until the end of the period.
That's really good information. I mainly only work on the commercial lending side with my clients.
Paul, we were having an off-camera discussion about service charges earlier. Are they tending to put any restriction on the percentage of service charge in relation to value of the building now?
Yeah, they are. There's a sort of general rule of thumb with ground rents, which I believe is 0.01% of the purchase price. Most lenders won't go over that. So now most landlords, freeholders are setting it at that. Sure. There's no rule, I don't believe, with service charges. But for example, I have just had a case where a client bought off plan, service charge was $1,400, I think. And now that it's complete, the service charge is $1,650. And the lender reduced the valuation by $3,000 because of that.
Really?
Yeah, so yes, they do account for it, and their reasoning behind that was that all of the costs added up to about 30% of rent.
Okay.
So they were concerned about serviceability.
Sure. Any comments, Nick?
I mean, all I'd add is it's sort of simple mathematics, isn't it? Like any business, it's money in versus money out. So if you've got more money going out, that needs to be considered and will be considered by lenders and people looking to buy that property.
I suppose the key
a
point there, and you mentioned about that formula seemed complicated. You know, just seek advice, speak to someone who understands it. Yes. There's about 3,000 buy-to-let products in the market now, and more than half of them are only available through intermediaries or brokers.
Sure.
So going and speaking to your local bank about what you can do, you'll often end up with a much worse product than if you spoke with an independent broker.
I've always had the feeling, I think, on these things, especially if you're going into the market for the first time, better to speak to a good broker rather than a normal bank. Nothing against banks, but brokers have got such a specific knowledge of probably the area and the product and yourself, it's always quite important.
It's definitely important to find a good broker as well, someone who takes your whole life picture into consideration and not just that one deal, because they might get you the best deal at the time, but they haven't looked at all the other criteria to meet your life goal.
Okay, thanks gents for that. Nick, your last question. If I wanted to buy a 3-storey property and add a floor to it, how easy would that be? I thought I heard of some kind of approved scheme for this sort of thing, using modular building methods.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there's lots of things to consider there. It seems the question's angled slightly towards the construction side of things. So is it possible? Really needs to be checked out on a case-by-case basis. You'll need a structural engineer to look at the existing building. Can the foundations take an extra load? And then what construction method is going to be used for that extra story? There are some very interesting modular builds coming out, and they can be sort of slotted into place, almost prefabricated off-site, very lightweight, and they go up very, very quickly and be weatherproof within a matter of days. So some very interesting construction methods out there that are allowing that to be possible, but certainly case-by-case basis, you need to look at the building, the current structural, the area around it, the neighbouring properties. Obviously you've got to get through all the planning side of things first. We're currently developing a site in Newbury in Berkshire, which is a 10,500 square foot 3-storey office, which we're looking to put a whole story onto.
Okay.
So we've had to have various excavations done to check the foundations and check it can be done.
There seems to be a whole new industry in London of sort of popping another story on something, building a penthouse on top of a block of flats even, and that sort of thing. Are you experiencing that where you are?
No, not at all really. I mean, there's enough stock in my area at the moment to just redevelop the commercial. Adding, I mean, even land value. If you were to purchase a plot of land where I am, you couldn't build. The cost of build wouldn't make sense to do it. So I'm just, cleaning up with the commercial conversions and the refurbishments of old blocks of flats at the moment.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for all your answers. Very helpful, I'm sure. So I'm going to say thank you to Steve Jacob, Chairman of the Fabrik Property Group, Paul Mahoney, MD of Nova Financial Group, and Nick Wallwork, CEO of propertyforum.com. Thank you all very much indeed. Join us again next time for Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Gelapin. See you next time.
If you have any questions that you would like to send to any of our experts at Property Question Time, you can submit them via our website, on social media, or email us at info@propertytelevision.co.uk.